Welcome to Technology Tangents. We get leaders together to discuss the important tech of today and the implications for tomorrow. Our discussions are fun, lighthearted, and frankly opinionated, but hopefully gives you a sense of what matters, what to pay attention to, and what to ignore. Today, I want to talk about waste. Not garbage waste, but waste collection within organizations and within our government as a microcosm. Putting the politics aside, if we can, basically impossible.
No politics, okay.
Let's talk only about tech debt.
Basically impossible, I suspect, on this topic. But really, we've seen a massive amount in the first 30-ish days of the new U.S. president. And in particular, with one department he's funded, DOGE, run by our favorite Elon Musk, who is running through that place and finding inefficiencies, waste, and other things that are fascinating on many levels, and trying to disperse of all of that as quickly as possible. The thing I really want to get into is, again, using the U.S. government as a microcosm that everybody is aware of. It's certainly public. It's certainly a big deal and affects a lot of Americans specifically. But it's true in corporate America too, I suspect. And that's really what I want to get to is, how do we take these lessons learned, pull it into corporate America, and for the listeners of the show, what do they do about it? So just to kick us off, a few things, a couple surprising bits of information here that I think we've come through. First of all, DOGE is a very small team. It's a handful, a tiger team, a strike team, a SWAT team, whatever of these phrases you want to use that we've talked about for a long time in technology. They've gone in and they've found enormous amounts of spending that are probably not aligned with the intent of the legislators when they approved that budget. We have really inefficient processes. For example, we have a mine shaft that literally people, actual employees of the government, paperwork gets sent in paper to the bottom of a mine and then stored. And then when they want to retire or leave, somebody has to go down to the bottom of the mine and pull those things out. I mean, this is an amazing technology in the 1960s or 50s, perhaps, when you're worried about Cold War and sort of how do you preserve things over long durations. But it seems insane to me in the modern world of digital redundancy that every company has. So my just first question is, in response to what you've seen more broadly, how does this even happen? How do we get to a place where in 2025, there's still a department of the government that sends paper to the bottom of a mine for safekeeping? Jason, you want to kick us off on how does that happen? Like, how do you not have a process that fixes that?
This section sponsored by Iron Mountain.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's several things. We always joke in consulting that all clients have problems. They're always people problems, and this one I think is largely people and budgeting problem. And so when things work, there's the old adage, don't fix it if it's not broken. And I think in a large part, people put systems in place. They work given the technology of the time. It's the same with the Department of Motor Vehicles. Like we put these things in place, and this is how we do them. Well, then, technology marches along and advances, and there's all kinds of new, better ways to do things, self-service, on the web, with mobile. But the government has to spend money to adopt those. And, when there's a lot of things vying for government money, everything from healthcare to, defense and all of those things, and just, I think, modernizing systems goes to the list, as it does with companies and our customers as well. Okay, well, that one's working, and we've got these other pressing issues, so we're going to go work on the pressing issues. And it becomes, it's the in the Eisenhower framework, it's important but not urgent.
Sure.
Right? And the other aspect I think that happens is people are people, and if you this is especially true in companies. I would assume it's true in government too. Your pay, your visibility, your reputation, all of those things around your seniority is based on how many people you have under you. And if you say, well, I want to, I've got 10,000 people I'm responsible for, and therefore I'm vice president, and I require a lot of staff, perks, pay, and all of those things to keep these 10,000 people in line. If someone comes in and automates that, it's really what am I going to do? Have you just then worked yourself out of a job? And so I think those are the two factors. No one wants to work themselves out of a job, and no one wants to, spend money fixing stuff if they don't feel like it is broken. And the that problem with that not fixing things and they're broken is you become the stereotypical boiled frog, right? It's probably fine. Your 1960 solution, it's probably fine in 1968 and 70. 74 is probably getting a little long in the tooth, but in 2024 it looks purely ancient, but that's just because we've kept pushing it off and kept pushing it off and kept pushing it off.
Just a people problem from your perspective. The technology is easily solved as every company now has DR type solutions in place. We have 700 people who are responsible for this very manual process to deal with retirement as the government. It's just an example. Again, every company has their own example, but as an example, we have the government spending $28 million on camouflage that their own internal agencies have effectively said is ineffective and they don't want to use it. We have a myriad of just these examples coming time and time again. It seems that the incentives are a big part of what you're suggesting there, which is nobody's really incented to go through an organization, in the government specifically, and remove things of waste.
I don't want to suggest that it's easy, right? Because let's say you were going to digitize and make an online system for our retirement, right? Well, okay, building a system to track, employment and retirement, that's not hard. Now, you do have to do a lot of security. I mean, that's sensitive information, but again, other companies offer that, Workday and others. So there are ways to protect information. It's just, it's a bit of a, just some things you have to go do. It's a little bit of work, but the real challenge is migrating. So whether you're a company with a legacy system or in this case, the government with stuff buried in a mine, like how do you if I want to go online and retire, well, the paperwork's sitting down. There's no online version, so someone has to get that data in, and it's getting that data migrated or digitized that is again the big, I think, long pole in the tent from a modernization.
But let's not forget, it's 700 people they currently have in this office.
Yeah.
So even at $100,000 fully loaded costs, which my guess is, given pension the government offers, is probably much higher than that on average. I bet we could probably move that if they came to Credera and said, "Hey, do you want to come do this migration for us?" We've done lots of migrations. I don't know that we've ever had a 700-person team working to migrate even a pretty big, gnarly system for any duration of time, meaning your payback is going to be incredibly short.
Yeah, and there's a huge opportunity to use AI. See, I'm bringing AI in this week, not you. So, but there is a huge opportunity for that technology because, traditional OCR, a lot of those things are not great at that. But some of the new computer vision and some of the other models are, and software that's available is really good at doing that. I think you could probably largely automate a good section of it with. And then you can also, we've done this with other companies before. You say, well, how do you validate that? Well, the good news is you have an actual tester that actually knows the right answer, the person, right? So if you're going to digitize your driver's license or whatever record, you can always send out an email and say, hey, we've digitized this. You have to go in and correct any things. Now, you have to be a little careful around, don't let them change their birth date, stuff like that. But you can request that it be changed, and then everyone can do that. And it's a very cheap and efficient way to get other people to do your test validation for you in migrations.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, there is somebody who cares deeply about that being the correct answer, the person who's going to receive that. As long as you provide some mechanism for feedback, suddenly you get a great system. And as I was reminded by TK when I worked at Uber, look, at the end of the day, it's a finite number. He never cared. It'd be well, how many airports are there? I can't have time to somebody at every airport and figure out how it's going to work for airports and venues as a pickup location. And he's like, well, how many are there? And I was like, I don't know, a couple thousand that are major airports. It's great, it's a couple thousand. That's small. That's a small number. That's tractable. You can go do that thing. And so even if you had to check each one of these individually, it's not that many pieces of paper. It's not that many records. You could be smart about it. You could use statistics about it. You know the distribution of these things. You don't have to check each one. But even he did. Still not that many. And to your point, there's a really great fallback, which is the person who actually cares deeply about you getting it right, a bit like tests when you're grading, they'll come to you. If you give them a mechanism, they'll come to you and they'll tell you it's wrong and you can validate that one case.
Yeah.
So Kevin, back to you. On this incentive point, really, like, I think that there is typically no portion of an organization that I'm aware of that's responsible for cleanup. Should there be? How do you create incentives so that the 700 people have a mechanism to raise their hand and say, hey, I think there's probably a better way to do this? Because I don't think they're malicious. I don't think they're bad people. I think they're just doing what they're told to do. Yeah. And how do you create an organization that allows that feedback to come back in and improve?
I think that, I mean, it's interesting around is like, what's the measurement that we're looking at? So you think about, well, if you're 700 people, we're in a mine. I'm assuming that's not a mine that's in DC. So, it's probably in someone's in their district. Someone's making the choice. It's number of resources. So I think that's a lot of this stuff. It's really around appropriations and budget is probably much more about what they're actually doing and how that plays through that. It's the same thing so what is the actual value? You think about the goal of having, efficiently use a taxpayer dollar, like that's a really good objective. I would hope that can be a nonpartisan activity, but it's hard to do. It's hard to work through that. It's hard to, even take this simple example of a, relatively technology fix for this. That you think about, the actual cost to doing it and getting implemented is much less than probably the procurement process, getting agreement and alignment. I mean, Jason, you've worked within government, IT solutions. That the amount of rules that you have to be able to make it work become almost inhibiting to actually just going after it. So which is what's so fascinating with what Musk is doing is that it's almost like I've got a remit to go after it without, regardless of the political ramifications of that. And I think that's one of the other things around the government. I mean, for a company, we all have competitive advantage. At some point, if you had extreme waste, there is going to be a consequence at some point for that. If you're a state or local government, you have to actually balance your budget. So therefore, you have to do it. We have a moral hazard, I think, in elements of our federal government where they can print money. So therefore, the waste is harder to get, because then you can go, what is the competitive advantage, or what's the real need to be able, well, I need to get votes to win the next election. Well, how do you do that? Well, not by getting rid of 700 people that are working in my district. And so I think we're going to have to decide ultimately as a society whether or not efficiency and the trade-off decisions, right? This is the part that I hope we can eventually get to, is really going back to where companies, like, you have to come back and say every single decision has a trade-off, and you have to be able to, the element of, like, how do you get that to the highest degree of being able to make the appropriate decision, whether that be technology investments. We have this all the time, right? You ask clients between what's the expected payoff, should I do it, should I make this debt decision? Those are always really hard, because you're essentially having to say, well, I'm going to get no new functionality, but I'm doing the right thing for the future. And I think those are hard, and I think that for a government, I think it's even more harder, although I think we'd all like to believe that the government would act in the best interest. I think it's actually a really hard decision. So therefore, you find these different elements like this, lots of pet projects, lots of different elements of that. And I think, we may be getting to the spot to where the debt is, and really as our, as the baby boomers continue to retire, we're going to have our choices are entitlements or defense or inefficiency. Right now we're going after inefficiency, and I know it's painful and it's obviously very politicalized and sensationalized, but I think it's going to be, we're facing hard decisions, and actually I'm excited that we're at least trying to have the decisions, maybe a little bit reckless at times in how the approach is, but it's, the more we get these examples of where we're going to have to make hard choices, and I'd like to put choices in how we take care of our people, how we protect our environment, how we protect our land, how do we protect, I think many of those things are going to be widely appreciated. Some of the things that we're hearing about now that are more, probably a smaller percentage of people would say that would be my priority. And I think that we have to bring those to the light of day. So.
Yeah, I think to that point, just to follow up on that one thing you said there, is you think about the incentives that, say, effectively Congress people have, whether it be House or Senate, they're incented to drive good business job growth for their state, for their constituency, effectively. Yep. Within a company, the same could be said, as you alluded to earlier, Jason, with it, which is, hey, if I want to get a promotion, I need to run a bigger budget. I need to have more people under me. How do you create organizations that enable that? In a corollary, I suspect, but a different question, or perhaps different question, I think it's a corollary, is something like when you see this waste that's so blunt, so blatant. I mean, again, you could remove all the stuff on the edge. There are many cases it's very obvious this is ineffective use of our dollars. There's still a lot of pushback. Yeah. What drives the pushback against wanting to get to a better use of the dollars you have, whether it be the government or within a company?
Yeah, but I think it's interesting around even, I'll get back to the question, but I think I'm just even thinking about from a public perspective or a company perspective, the difference between a public and private, right? I mean, the fact that everything is so driven on short-term results, why do we not make technology investments that will fuel future growth and earnings? Because today, that's going to hurt my earnings today, or the threat of that it will hurt my earnings today. So therefore, I make the inefficient long-term decision for the short-term, right? That's more rampant within, or at least conventional wisdom says more rampant in
publicly traded
in kind of public versus that. I mean, private equity also has that, right? They have a more short-term horizon. So I think we're seeing that with some of our clients today, just that are having activist investors that are trying to take short-term results that potentially may not have long-term benefits. Those time horizons aren't always mutually aligned. Well, I think the same thing definitely plays out within the public sector, and I actually think it's worse. In the sense that standpoint of like, either you have the stereotypical someone's been in Biden and was in public service for 50, 60 years, and well, is that a good thing or bad thing? It's actually an interesting question. Term limits, is that a good thing or bad thing? Well, it's an interesting question. But I think if your primary objective is to get reelected, you're going to have different choices than versus your primary is trying to have what's best for society. And it's difficult to assess that. But going back to a company, I think that as leaders in a company, we have to constantly balancing the short term versus the long term. And I would say this as senior leaders, which the three of us are, I think we should be more held accountable to long-term objectives. Is that going to be hard at moments? Is that going to be challenging? It absolutely is. But I think that is why the fiduciary responsible is for the long-term growth of an organization, solvency, legacy. Like, these are the themes that I would hope that our government is thinking about too. That we're thinking about the next 300 years, not just simply the first 300 years, but that takes a mature perspective. I think one thing that's also unique about Musk is that he may be one of the few people in the history of society that could really don't give a damn, right? His legacy is not going to be left here. He's got multiple legacies that he's leading. And so I think that puts him in a unique position to go after this. And
a bit of a free roll, as it were.
Absolutely. And, and I think one of the things that we've been debating and just kind of, I think just even at my own, whether it be us or my wife and I had this discussion yesterday just around what would it be like if Harris would have won and deployed Musk to do exactly the same thing? Would there be the same uproar? Mm-hmm. I don't know. My suspicion is no. Now, he probably would have gone after maybe some slightly different topics. But I think that this ultimately goes back, in my view, mostly to politics and it's around the simplistic view of my person is not in this power, therefore I don't like that, working for that, versus trying to work through that. And similarly, does it have to be as sensational as it is right now? Do we have to see Musk in every single thing? No, I think that would be also helpful if he was a little less in the public eye, but that's not exactly his persona. So
I'm going to amend to my answer. One, don't fix it if it's not broken. Two, people's incentives. The regulations and the procurement and regulations is also a reason people avoid modernizing things, because it's like, you hear the horror stories about people trying to rebuild a house or doing, replace their roof in California or some of the other places where there are a lot of restrictions. It becomes impossible, and no one wants to, spend 2 years of their life trying to meet all the regulations just to get started, right? And I think that's also something that we need to look at, is how do we, and I'm not anti-regulation, right? I think there are good, but you need to have the right size. Like, what is it that this data is, what data are we managing? What systems are we modernizing? What's the right set of controls for that level of risk, right? And we don't have to treat everything with the same level of sensitivity and security as the nuclear codes. But often that's what happens with these regulations is like they become whatever the superset of the most restrictive regulations are. Everyone needs to do that. I've got this on-running battle with the city that I live in, outside of or inside of Dallas. That helps narrow it down. But because I wanted to replace a small section of fence, 14 inches of fence, and the regulations and the permits. I'm like, I need a permit to replace 14 inches of fence. They're like, well, you need a permit to replace more than 25% of your fence. And I'm like, well, it's only 14 inches. And I'm like, it's the gap between my neighbor's fence and my garage. And they're like, well, that's 100% of the fence on that side of the house. And so, there's just this dogma, these regulations can turn into dogma, which are, actually get worse outcomes, and not only does it not prevent the thing they were designed to prevent, which is, someone building a fence out of broken glass or something, they actually work against those objectives because now I've got like a big rotten fence.
Right.
So the solution is you and Leslie are moving to California?
Yeah, no.
So to that point of technology and AI and the regulation more broadly, I think we're seeing that start to hit up against a lot of the issues that you just said, which is DOJ is now trying to get access to additional systems, including military systems, other sensitive information. Of course, we had the stuff with the department that keeps the nuclear codes, not the nuclear codes people, but anyway, related. And there's this promise, there's this thought that this small team powered with AI, which they're using extensively, is able to really find all of this stuff incredibly quickly. We're talking about billions of dollars of identified opportunities for savings that they found in a few weeks. Do you think that AI is going to continue to be up to the task in this space, Jason? Or do you think that just this history, this bureaucracy, this complexity that's associated with these very old, largely cobalt and pre-cobalt kind of systems is up for it?
Well, we're talking about, I'm going to lump, you're saying AI, but I think we are lumping a lot of things together there. That's traditional machine learning algorithms. It's large language models, but it's also, a lot of what they've been able to do is just by really using graph technology really effectively. You can actually see it, in the reports they publish. Graph technology is really interesting. Everyone, kind of knows about it. They kind of talk about it, but no one really does it in depth. But, well, a few companies do it in depth. I mean, it's really good. The one thing it's used heavily for is finding fraud, right? So if you go to, if you look at credit card companies and banks, they use graph technology heavily to find fraud, right? And you can see in what they do that that's what they're using. So if you think that whole group of technologies, it's not just, large language models, then yes, I think that whole, if you take the whole tool belt, the whole toolbox, I guess, of technologies, I do think you can solve find things, solve a lot of these problems effectively, quickly, and with the appropriate security controls. Now, that doesn't mean you just go throw it all into Chat GPT and it gives you the answer. That's not what they're doing. But they're way more sophisticated. Yeah, they're way more sophisticated. And I see some of these articles like, oh well, people complain it's a COBOL system and COBOL defaults to 9999. People aren't really that's not the real data. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that the guy with 3 PhDs in computer science and mathematics knows how to handle that, right? That's not, some of that stuff is kind of silly, I think. But yeah, I do think that a lot of the broader technology tool set will can address a lot of those things if it's just prioritized. I mean, we see it in our own business and with clients, right? We're working, with companies that are, let's say, moving to a different cloud provider, right? That's a pretty straightforward, easy, automatable thing with the appropriate tools. We talked about the, modernizing data and having, people validate their own data. I mean, if you look at the landscape, there are enough things to get these things done effectively.
But I think that's maybe where some of this is interesting right now. It's the approach, right? If we would have gone back and had a candidate that said, "Hey, I'm going to increase the budget spending by 10%, or I'm going to decrease the actual budget by 10%," and if let's say that would have been the mandate that would have been charged, and how you would have gone do that, well, then I'm going to go back to my departments and go after that. You're going to rein in the non governed bureaucracy, right? You're seeing all these different things. So I wonder if, there's this speed, there's the sensationalism, it's Musk, it's this, it's all the junior 22-year-olds. I mean, all that stuff is like just kind of catnip to it. But if you actually were to come back and say, hey, each department, my charge for you is to be the most efficient steward of the taxpayer dollars, and you actually define what that is, I think that you could have some of these discussions. I mean, there's definitely a role of a government in terms of what you do this. And I think that, I think it's just, I mean, not to make this about Musk, although it seems to be that's a lot of where it's at. In fact, it's kind of interesting to see where, his track record would suggest that he'll lose interest at some point. And so that's not a good or bad statement on him. I just think it's a track record. So, this is this frantic nature. If you go back and read how he's built companies, like he's got intense moments of time, how he does something. Well, I don't know. I would be so shocked. I'd be willing to bet. I'll do a bet with the two of you. Will he be in this position 4 years from now? I think the answer is not at close. And so I think my hope is that whatever's left behind actually still perpetuates. Like, we should ask and want our government to be doing the most efficient things possible, because at the end of the day, they need to steward dollars. And I think what's intriguing to me is you have some elements of your government where you're trying to cut waste, and then, again, for a podcast that wasn't going to be too political, we're going to be pretty political. But I mean, you look at some of those things that the early stages of what's going on in the health and human services, right? One of the first things there, we're trying to make it easier for trial attorneys to be able to sue the government because of vaccines. The previous administration was making it versus reducing the number of time that you could have a drug. So we're doing some things that have increased efficiency, something that have reduced, and I think that. My hope is that one of the benefits of government, and particularly when it comes to risk management, is I'd much rather have the government backstop drug development and be able to work through that than say, let's go rebuild high net worth neighborhoods, that are in a place where they're likely to have fires. Again, I'm not trying to throw negative shade on California, but like these are actually fundamental questions that I think every company has to ask. Right? We have to ask, where do you make these decisions? Where do you make the trade-off? Where do you handle that risk? Do you choose to go into this state? Right? You choose to go into that market because of what's going to be available to you. Like, companies have to make those decisions every day. And I think that, so actually having that be done somewhat in the public sector, I think is really wise. And I think that, not to repeat from before, but I would really like for companies to have different time horizons that we make decisions. I think one that's interesting about AI right now is it's accelerating so fast that you have to probably take some risk in what it looks like and what's going to be able to be used. But that's what's actually so much fun about right now, is just to seeing how crazy things are being used. And maybe we were talking about a little bit before. It's possible that we kind of hit the next adoption curve to where usage is increasing, and I think that that's exciting. And I think that, well, often that means ways that we did it before are going to have to continue. I mean, we were facing that in our company last week, right? How do we use AI to accelerate delivery? And there's individuals that are saying, well, why am I doing that? That means I'm going to make less money. And you have to that trade-off between, a way we used to do it and the way that we are going to do it. And we have to be willing to take the bets on the way we're going to do it. In the long run, that's the only way you survive, even in the short run, if it costs pain.
Yeah, and I think that's the big argument from not all economists, but many economists, is that the U.S.'s GDP is growing, but slowly. Our debt is growing quickly. And historically, if you look at nations, when the interest payments exceed a certain percentage of your GDP, those nations fail. And so you only have two options to solve that. One, you can decrease the debt payments that you have, or two, you can grow your way out of it. And what's exciting about AI is it might be both. It might actually give you the opportunity to grow your way out of it and give you the opportunity to cut all of this excessive waste that we don't really need. And so my question to you, Kevin, is I'm with you. AI is going to be a big deal, and I think it's going to be massively helpful on both those fronts. Are there any downsides from your perspective to deploying AI solutions so aggressively in an organization that's as bureaucratic as the government or another large enterprise corporation?
Yeah, we're going to make mistakes. You know, I mean, I think that, and again, go back, not to make it again all about Musk, but think about one of my favorite Muskisms, so to speak, is, you know, you cut to the point. If you have you got to cut to the point. If you made cuts and you haven't found that you cut too deep, you haven't cut deep enough, right? I think that works in a company, particularly when you're the primary owner of it. You know, it's a little different. You know, I'm not gonna suggest that we should go cut our civil service groups, although I mean, if we're honest, the last 5 years, we cut civil service groups without thinking about some of that stuff. And so I think this starts to really become really what you want to do. But I do think that because of the size of the government and the size of I mean, you can look at historical GDP spend, you can look at the overall just size of what that looks like. It would suggest that, you know, the size and the pace of the growth of government, that there is more opportunities there. And, you know, in this case, we have good examples too around the world of different approaches to governance, and you can see percentages of government spend and what that looks like, you know, good examples, bad examples of that. So I think we're at an interesting moment of, like, you know, you think, you know, do you want to be well, sorry, I'm going to take one step back. We're at an interesting moment because of this slightly different tact, is that, you know, there's probably based, you know, stereotypically on political lenses, do you believe that one job created is the same? Do you believe a job created within a public sector funded by public sector means is the same as a private sector job? I would say no. I think the private sector job is a higher return and for the common good of the environment. There's a lot of really, really smart people that would adamantly disagree with me on that. And so I think that that's another question we have to look through in real times of growth. The other element I would add into, you know, not to go back to your previous point around, you know, you've got growth, debt. This is what also, you have a declining birth rate. You have immigration policies that, you know, maybe are encouraging one type of immigration versus another. I mean, these are the other elements that we have to conclude. I mean, you have to have at the end of the day, people who are willing to pay taxes or companies that can pay taxes. And if you're declining in those areas, you have to reduce your spending. And I think that's the part that's such an interesting. So I look at the use of AI, these tools, to help accelerate that as a way to try to get it balanced. Other people, you know, maybe they're okay with a higher debt level or really kind of a ratio. So,
or tariffs. I saw an interesting op-ed that was suggesting we move away from taxes entirely and move it entirely to tariffs. Yeah. Fascinating idea. So if we look at this sort of waste that we've seen within the government, as we've alluded to and said explicitly, it happens within companies. When I was at GE, just as one simple example, I was, of course, over all AI data things. We were using Splunk at the time, and it was just a really poor implementation of Splunk. We were spending tens of millions of dollars on Splunk. It came to my attention, and we built something similar when we were at Uber, of course, when we were adjusting all this data. So why don't we just build our own effectively? And ultimately they did. But in that process, we ended up saving just in that first year by refactoring how we were using Splunk. We're still using Splunk, still license Splunk, still love Splunk. But just refactoring how we used it was saving $20 million annually in one tool, one licensing cost. It only came to my attention because I happened to be looking for money somewhere in the budget and came across this huge line item for a pet project that I had at Uber. And I was like, well, hold on, wait, tell me more about what's going on here. So my question is, Jason, why do some companies resist these proven efficiencies? I mean, Amazon's done amazing things with packaging, with logistics. GE, of course, did the licensing stuff. They've done stuff with great recycled products and using recyclable goods there to decrease the total output and carbon emissions and amount of waste. We have, even internally here at Credera, we have 3-4 different generative AI tools, some from our parent company, some internally, some at sort of a group level, that are largely redundant. And we're struggling to figure out, like, okay, how do we cull our bets to the ones that are really differentiated for us? What happens? Why do organizations struggle with this efficiency play?
Well, it's the same reasons, really. I mean, one, something gets built, like that, the Splunk solution you talked about, and it's working. And, we have limited resources, as companies, companies have limited resources. We've got like 10 new things we want to do. We've only got enough, people to go do, or enough people and money, whatever, to go do 5 of the 10 things we want. Right. Net new things that we want to add this feature. We want to do this. We want to add this, capability or update our product or service this way. Well, if I want 10, I can only do 5. I'm certainly not going to now only do 4 so that I can free up people to go find some more efficiencies. Even though, this is the short term, long term. If you were to do that, all right, well, now I've maybe got more money. I could go get some of these new things, right, that I don't have the money for today. And so I think it's a lot of I want it now, and I'm going to spend the money on it now. And if that means, we call this technical debt, right? This is the phrase we use in technology, is like, I'm not going to go fix some of these things that are, underlying. Well, 2 challenges with that. One is they compound, right? And they eventually get to a point where it's very, very difficult, very, very expensive to make any change. And in that kind of sense, it is true debt in the sense of you are having to pay for it as a tax on every single project you want to go do going forward. And so it just requires, a focus. We recommend to our clients, and I've recommended this to a lot of clients, and many of them have done it with great results, and many of them have politely asked me to leave, which is like, spend 30%. If you've got a product and you're the product manager, you're in charge of the budget for some product, spend 30% of your time or your resources on improving it, finding these inefficiencies, fixing the technical debt, driving out costs, driving up efficiency. And just to use a quick example of that from American Airlines, when I started, when we first launched the back-end digital platform that drives A.com and other things, it was launched on these 12 big refrigerator-sized boxes that had a lot of different cores in them, and
this is like vacuum tube days, or
no, this is Sun Solaris days. This is late 90s, early 2000. But by the time I left in 2005, we were handling a much greater volume, almost double the volume on 8 of those, right? And they're very expensive. Like, how is that? Well, we drive, you have a team that Google calls this the SRE, right? Site Reliability Engineering. They have this famous program called SRE 1K. Like, can we double the what we do at Google and run our systems without doubling the size of that team? The answer was yes, but they've got to focus even more and more on finding the efficiencies and automating those things out. And so it can be done. You just have to prioritize it. And this goes back to do you prioritize short-term or long-term? And it's like, well, short-term, yeah. Yes, long-term, those efficiencies are going to allow me to do all 10 things I want every year, or 15 things I want. But like this year, I'm only going to get 4, not 5. And so I'm not going to do it. Even though I think you keep that 30%, that doesn't mean you just get 70%. It means you get 70% this year, but on a relative basis, you may get 3. That's the remaining 70% may be able to do 2, 3, 4, 5 times as much stuff over time because you're getting some of the inefficiencies out of the system. So
it's a really interesting question to you then, Kevin. If 30% of the budget Jason recommends should be spent on cleaning things up, how do you as a CEO think about allocating strategically the budget and dollars and resources for us, Credera, or more broadly, Tech Parallels?
When you think about what's the average shelf life of CIO? 2 years? Because they get brought in to fix the other person's mistake, and the first thing they say is you got to spend, well, because they didn't spend 30% for the last 6 CIOs, now you got to spend this, and you get fired. There's no other reason to it, but yeah, I think ultimately comes down to, it's really hard because, again, we're all driven and held accountable to short-term results. And so this is what I think is an advantage of a public company. I think we were joking over the weekend around how much cash Berkshire Hathaway has. There's a reason why the public companies, those long buy and holds, actually matter, because they can have the fortitude to make these type decisions. It's very difficult to do that. I think it takes a bit of a principled leader and a leadership team where you have to somewhat understand that you're held to have key stakeholder. This is some elements maybe where you're getting to some of the stakeholder evaluation stuff but like if you really think about long-term perspective on that, you're willing to make those investments. But it's hard. But if you let me ask you, Vincent, you're such a good job moderating. Let me ask you a question. Back to your GE days. Yeah, I'm curious. We've talked before about some of that change of the heuristic, the Welch heuristic. If you're not number one or number two in your market, that we're going to get rid of you. Mm-hmm. I would imagine, what to the degree that was true or not. But if you were a manager in one of those divisions, your willingness to make aggressive efficiency plays to stay in 1 and 2 was really high. Right. And when that started to go away, well, then now my incentives to make those changes were different. So I don't know how much that from a leadership team perspective that was true, but that was a really clear mandate that required you to make bold decisions.
Exactly right. And I think it was incredibly powerful. Back to that, incentives matter. For certainty, if you don't remain 1 or 2, you're gone. So you'll literally just be fired. That is the incentive. Be number 1 or number 2, or you will not have a job at this company anymore. And there were many mechanisms that were very public. And again, the actual stack ranking were at least, by the way, people always just say it's 10%. It's at least 10% will be let go every single year. And as a result, people have a very different behavior. Similar when my days at Uber. Uber was a fascinating company because, first of all, we'd fire anybody. I saw many people fired in less than a month. You'd show up, you didn't deliver something great the first week. Okay. Second week, you're going to have a talking to. Third week, you're probably put on a PIP. Fourth week, you're gone. That's the company that it was, and you were just expected to deliver very quickly and totally unreasonable. The number of hours people put in there were insane. I mean, weekends were required if you wanted to do well at that company. And it's a very different culture. I think the flip of that is that attracts a certain type of person. I think it's really fun to be in those cultures because you're surrounded by people who are exceptional, who are trying incredibly hard, putting in the time, the effort. There's that joke, you can be smart, you can work hard, or you can work long. And typically companies want you to choose one of those. Amazon's big thing was choose 2 of those. TK's big thing was do all 3 or you're fired. That was kind of the mantra.
And Musk is that way too.
That's right. Musk is the same. And I think that Welch back in his heyday, and I didn't see him at that point in time. I came after that. But I suspect he was similar. This is a company, GE was a company that beat their quarterly earnings estimates by 1 cent every single quarter. Now, that's a lot of financial engineering and some shenanigans that aren't really to the point. But the point is they cared. To them, I believe culturally, that was a way of signaling we know what our business is doing. We know how to control our business, and it's under control. And we're going to prove it to you time and time and time again, quarter after quarter. Again, in that case, they ended up making fairly medium-term sacrifices at the expense of long-term. So they sold a bunch of debt that was probably a bad debt. They underwrote all this long-term healthcare, which is a bad deal, but it was a huge cash cow for them, and they liked it. But really, it just came down to the incentives. Yeah. And I think that this is what's so critical is, in my mind, it kind of leads to the next question, which is, who in a company is rewarded for this? So I had to go back to GE. I cut 20 million. Did anybody really care? I mean, the CEO was like, oh, that's good. I guess we're wasting a lot of money on
was
that.
Was that just your corporate jet expense, flying commercial?
That's barely that covered my flights.
Starbucks expense.
Starbucks expense.
My Starbucks and my flights barely covered by that. Yeah. But seriously, I didn't get any incremental budget. I didn't get an incremental team. I actually had to take part of my existing team. I did borrow a resource from sort of the CEO and his team to help project manage it, but I didn't get any additional resources. I had to go beg, borrow, plead to get a few resources here and there and pull from my own team to make that a reality. And so it was a huge disincentive, honestly, but it was a fun challenge for me personally. And I thought, wow, this is great. This is a pet project I did before. We're going to build out a whole new data collection services here too. I had some thoughts on how to make it even better from my days at Zillow and learning what we did there. But really, there was no upside for me. It was pure downside. And so the question to you back then is, Jason, I guess we can go for you again, which is like from a technology standpoint, who in an organization should be responsible as that garbage collection service that goes around and says, hey, we did this pilot. Hey, we stood up this demo environment. Hey, we whatever. We need to remove it. Or we have this license. It's no longer the best license. We have to get rid of this. And the challenge there is it's real work and the incentive is typically not aligned.
I think you really need to have it, if you're the CIO, the CTO, you've got teams that manage like these products and platforms and infrastructure and technology and support the business. Like those teams have to really take it upon themselves. And maybe the answer is those leaders that the CIO and their leaders over those products and platforms and services like have to really take it on if it doesn't work when it's external. Now, maybe you need someone like, today with Doge, maybe you need like a forcing function, right? Someone to come in short term and start driving it. But ultimately that, I saw, to your point about is Musk going to be there in 4 years, he's actually said he didn't think this would take, more than 2 years. Now, I think maybe he's over or underestimating how much the government's he's very good at like making these big bold claims, like we're going to go build an entire 100,000 node GPU cluster in Memphis, Tennessee, and he does it because there's no one pushing back, right? He's in control. Like there's a lot of institutional inertia in the federal government.
In fairness to that one, there was a lot of pushback. Right, like the colo wasn't going to do it. They couldn't pull them off of the racks in time. The colo's like, no, you can't do it. You have to use our approved vendor. There were a lot of. In fairness, there were a lot of.
Let's just say he hasn't seen the type of institutional inertia he's seen at the government, right? But back to the company. So, someone short term like that, a consultant will do it. But if it's not, it's like hiring a personal trainer and a personal chef for 3 weeks. Great. Like it probably has great results over those 3 weeks. Probably lose 5 or 10 pounds and, get in better shape. But like those people leave, you have to keep doing it, right? So you have to institutionalize that in the leaders, I think.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Kevin, like as you look at this, then how do you do these kinds of cost-cutting actions without destroying morale and innovation in particular in the company? Of course, we're seeing the morale hit across. In fact, we had somebody apply from a government agency. He hasn't been affected yet, but he reads the writing on the wall. He seems like a sharp guy. He seems like he'd actually survive and be fine. But nevertheless, you do sort of have this mentality like, oh shit, I might lose your top people. So how do you do this effectively without losing your top people, without killing morale and keeping that spirit of innovation back to the point of growth?
Yeah, I think some of this is where it's really around how do we continue, what's the evaluation of how you evaluate what we do as a company. I'm going to stick very much on the company perspective. Like we're incentivized for short-term results. The market prioritizes short-term results. A lot of our bonus plans are prioritized in short-term results, right? I mean, and so I think as a leadership team, you have to continue to evaluate how do you assess your talent around those different inventions. And I think that I would like to think that you'd have enough in just your own fortitude of trying to build an ongoing concern that you would be willing to do that. I mean, it's a little bit of Pollyanna, though. I mean, I think, again, go back to what's the shelf life of an executive or a C-suite in a public company? Well, it's relatively short. Well, why is that? Because you're measured on those results. So you're incentivized in some of this system. This is classic public versus private versus other things. We're not going to change it on this podcast, but I think that you can try to change it in individual settings. You can try to work through that. You can try to make, whether it be, I think the 30% is an interesting number. It's not just around tech debt. Vincent, you talked about innovation, around growth, how we think about that, the investment in terms of how we grow. What's the things that we immediately cut? Well, we can cut the incentive programs to fix tech debt. We combat learning and development. We cut all these other things that ultimately help us make a longer term concern. And I think until activists value those things differently, it's going to be difficult. I think this starts to get into why some would say this is value, why you'd have more of a state-funded type environment or economy is because, well, they have the long-term incentive, and then that gets plus, well, do you think that's inefficient, right? I mean, I think that's ultimately we get back into what's the incentive. We talked about several of these, but we haven't talked about the employee. What's the incentive of a government employee to be efficient? Well, there's very little. Meaning that for many government employees, just even like when you're thinking about, when you go back to that classical, most public sector does not have pensions anymore unless you're in a public sector or a private sector union. Well, that creates great incentive for you as an employee to want to work, exceed, plan for that. Well, if you're in a public job and you're measuring long-term, retirement, pension, other things, maybe giving up short-term benefits to be able to do that, like that's a very different equation. Like the equation then becomes, well, how long can I stay? I mean, I was in some conversations recently where, the premise was around, well, how long I want to stay here. And I'm like, well, I would like you to stay here too. Well, then let's perform, whether that be in a client, whether it be in our company, whether it be in the government. And I think we're missing that a little bit to where, I think we all serve at the pleasure of someone else. And I think that, I would love to think that we'd all be motivated that way. I know that that's not the case, but as leaders, I think we can build that culture in where it's really around, I would even argue in times that are hard, like when you make efficiency plays, whether it be in technology or ultimately with people, skill sets, you're still making a trade-off decision. Do you try to save everyone? Do you try to grow everyone? Do you try to, we have these different products. Go back to the classic examples of Lore and Intel and others that made huge decisions around that completely changed their business. And do you really? That's the whole crux of destructive capitalism, right? I mean, now you're going to get me start talking about Booth and University of Chicago, and I'll be happy. But to me, there's a reason why those things again goes back to the Darwin nature of natural selection. And I think that when we try to resist that. I think governments try to resist that. Large companies, that's where we start to go. So, I think the native instinct for us is to evolve, to innovate, to grow, and often that requires us to remove. I think that the tension often exists that we're afraid to do that. And I think the more we actually bring that into society, so now we're in a moment where you have AI, you have tools that are different. Well, I have a choice to say no. I have a choice to say yes. I have a choice to embrace. I have a choice to, actually, make some risks. I think it's classic. To me, it's very interesting. You look at the space program. I'm going to use Musk. Like, look at the early space and the calculated risks that were taken in the 60s and the 70s and 80s when it came to space, to where. What did we do for the 80s, 90s, post-Challenger, we became very risk adverse, and it took Musk and the private sector to come back in and to make calculated risks then and be willing to have the consequence of those risks. And so I think as society, we're going to have to take risks to be able to continue to evolve, and I think technology and AI is a way to do that today. This is obviously, I love the optimism in this approach. And that's what gets me excited, but I also know that requires us to change, and that's really hard.
Well, I think, what you said earlier, there's no competition with the federal government, and so competition is what drives a lot of that. So there's no incentive to really get rid of waste or innovate. There is, an incentive to not have any bad news, not have a disaster, and so I think it's somewhat. I think it is then the private sector which is going to have to drive a lot of those things. But back to your original question around morale is, which I think started this topic, was how do you do that without it impacting the morale of employees? Look, I think it improves the morale. Like, if you go talk to any, one working with some legacy technology, legacy system working, having to fill out, 10 forms in what should be a push of the button. No one likes doing that, right? And so if you can start making, doing some of these automation and driving efficiency and getting some of that friction out of the machine, I think it makes everybody happier.
Well,
except for the ones that got.
I was going to say, except for the person who was creating the TPS report that you now have to fill out.
That person can get, yes, but like retrain that. We've talked about that. Like, get that person using their. Like, I don't think they want to create the TPS reports. I think they'd much rather be doing something productive, right? But that's their role, and that's how they keep their role. So if you can provide them, okay, we're going to get rid of you doing that, but here's something productive you can go do. Learn these tools, learn this, and have someone do that. I think that would be beneficial to everyone. It just requires some courage, I guess, to take on some of those investments.
I think you're right. And I would say the challenge here is the only way you prevent that morale hit is by innovating and growing. And I think the challenge is as you're not investing in the growth aspect while you're trying to get the efficiencies back out because you're spending all of your dollars on maintaining this overbloated system, it becomes difficult.
Well, I think I think those are the two sides of the same coin. You have to do the efficiencies to be able to fund the growth.
But I'm saying it's sequenced. They're not parallel. In other words, you have to get the efficiencies out so you can realize the bottom line savings so that you can reinvest in the growth, and there's a natural lag between those two. Mm-hmm. Efficiencies are quick. I can go lay people off tomorrow, not literally, but conceptually. If I'm going to then figure out how to repurpose those people in a whole new discipline, that's going to take time. And so you end up with this gap where you do have an impact on morale. And if you can't underwrite that gap, you effectively let people go, which kills morale more. And then you can start growing again if you have the right people. But again, back to the point, you start losing some good people in that morale. And that's why it becomes so challenging, I think, for many organizations. It's also why I think you have to have somebody who's a bit of a free roll. You have to have somebody who's willing to put their badge on the table and say, I believe in this. This is the best thing for this company long term. I'm going to make my bet. I'm going to put my career on it in some cases. And that's difficult. It's a difficult job because most people, by the time they get into a position that have that authority, are more interested in preserving their job. Yeah. We take the repurposing of
I'll use
IKEA in their customer service being repurposed as designers. It was a great example. Look, IKEA cut 80% of their inbound calls because Gen AI became the customer service to solve the problem for them. Wonderful. They have all these people now, roughly 2/3 of their people are useless in that capacity. They said, great, we're going to build a new service that uses Gen AI to help do design. So people will take photos of their rooms. We'll charge $20 for it. Whole new revenue stream. We can use the people that were customer service now to do design services. Wonderful. But even that really simple example, it takes time to build the solution, to get revenue, to cover those delta.
I think
so
there's a much smaller, faster thing. Like, look, there's 100 different FinOps tools for cloud operations. I'll just use that as an example.
Sure.
Like, those take a couple of days to set up.
Sure.
And you immediately get some. Now, is it as big as like going and refactoring how everybody's storage utility or packing things more dense on the server? No, but you can get that done in 2 days and then free up, resource to go do the next thing.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at, so I agree with you. I agree, and you can and should go do those things. But given the same resources, should you do that thing, or should you go to the thing that's going to save you $10, $20 million? We're talking about 700 people who are responsible for like going up and down a mine shaft, for example. Like, to find the scale of opportunities that we have, 2/3 of the call center for IKEA. I mean, that's a lot of people. We're talking about huge numbers here. I think there's just an intrinsic delay, a lag between reducing the need for them and finding new opportunities at that scale.
But I think you get to the small scale exponentially, meaning you start something and you get 1, and then you get 2, and then you get 4, and then you get 8, right? And those things can go real quick as long as you're, iterating quickly.
But I'm saying,
it's when you try to go like, hey, we're going to go, and this is what I see companies do wrong all the time. Mm-hmm. They want to go try to figure out how to do 700 people, right? Or let's cut 1,000 people out of the call center, or 400 people, whatever it was. I guarantee you that wasn't their first initiative.
Sure.
Right? That's a lot of things that build up to that.
But in Klarna, they still have yet to come with any use for those 800 people. Right. My point is, like, finding new opportunities to grow is a lot harder than I think cutting these days, because I think we've gone through a phase, economically macro, where cost of capital is near zero. It never makes financial sense to go back and take care of your tech debt, because I'll just get more money, I'll get a bigger loan, I'll do an IPO, I'll issue more stock, whatever. And everything is up and to the right. And so I think the opportunity to go through and find waste and inefficiency in corporations, the same scale as the government, is way easier than it would be, because there's been no cleanup. There's been no efficiency plays for years, a decade, effectively. So my guess is, like, there's a lag between those two at a macro scale. Maybe not in an instance. Maybe you can find some easy cloud cleanup software that reduces your compute, your instances can shut down, scale better, et cetera. But that's not going to be the scale that I'm talking about. I think the real scale here is a lot bigger, like an order of magnitude at least bigger. No? Yeah.
I understand. Like, there's a difference in my mind between, like, what's the right size of an organization and all the products and resources that it needs to fulfill its mission and grow and, long term. And so whatever that growth curve is, like, you can also be over sure. and have waste and people not doing anything contributing to that. And again, I think that needs to be cut. I'm not saying don't cut anything, but again, I don't think that hurts morale when, I think the remaining employees that are productive, I mean, are not going to be upset that we're cutting unproductive things to be able to go do some of the things that will make their lives better.
This is where some of the stuff I put back into there's some just general society norms. I think, but say companies, how much is return to office policies truly about efficiency versus thing? I think a lot of it is. I mean, I think a lot of it is it's changing. You get a once in a 100-year event that occurred that required us to radically change how we approached work. Well, now we're in a different scenario. Well, for some, we'll take advantage of that, meaning different ways. And so how does that play out? But I think a lot of it is associated with cost and productivity. I think there was also a cultural norm change themes that we've talked about in many, many of our podcasts before. I'm intrigued by just other trends that are going on. Obviously, you guys, what I do in my personal life around education. Well, what's the moral hazard of essentially getting rid of any type of criteria of success in education for 2 generations?
Right.
Well, now you've got a workforce who never have been held accountable to those objectives. And so, these are some things that are hitting us. And then now you throw in a technology tool that essentially takes out some of that need, can actually do things much more efficient. And there's going to be collateral damage that's going to be part of that. And I think what's going to be really intriguing to me is really around what is as a society, how far are we willing to go to allow winners and losers to actually occur? And then what happens to the people that would be considered losers? And what is it going to be? And I think right now, the risk is that, well, typically it's like it becomes a have and have not, and therefore the haves need to be able to give to the have nots instead of saying, well, why can't the have nots? Why can't we all raise? I mean, this again, going back, starting from the end of this podcast where we started in some ways, but I think that's where the hope has to be, whether it be done at the government level, the company level, and just in our own individual levels. Like I think we can all control in our areas and spheres of influence. How do we bring back themes of innovation, growth, excitement, meritocracy? Like these are all really cool things that have always been part of the human condition. I think there's been huge events throughout history. Look at the last 100 years, the Depression, World War II, computer age, like huge elementary things that changed society. I'm intrigued. Well, what's next? Is that AI? Is that just an extension of that? I hope that it's not a negative thing that requires us to be able to, requires change. But sometimes it takes big macro things like that to force the change and innovation. I'm still slowly working my way through Isaacson's Innovators, and I'm right now post-World War II, all the computer stuff. And it's just fascinating the amount of change that occurred because of that event and huge government spending that went into those investments that then fueled the next stage of technical innovation. Like that's where government's at its best. And so what's that next thing for us? And I'd much rather have us be able to fuel innovation that drives society growth than continue to really pay for people to stay in status quo.
Yeah, I think that's great. And there's no doubt there's a lot of opportunity here for government. There's a lot of opportunity for corporations as well. But we've also come out of this world where money's been free. It's candy and unicorns and rainbows for everyone. As many hot tubs as you want in the pool off the balcony of our startup, because why not, right? That's a thing. So I think that what we're going to see is this change in evolution. I think it just macro doesn't allow that anymore. Waste is everywhere, but I think we've said it can be beaten by technology, and it will ultimately. But the balance then will be tricky. How do you do this well? So in closing, any thoughts from you guys about what our listeners should take away today, and one thing they could potentially do, as they hear this podcast within their own organization?
Did you know that Vincent had the hot tub budget? I didn't realize that was still around. I'm looking for where is that? Where's the hot tub budget?
That's behind a secret door. You guys don't have access yet. Sorry.
Don't have access to that door. Okay.
Yeah.
My answer is dedicate some portion, to efficiency, tech debt, whatever you want to call it, in your solutions, and start driving that out. And that doesn't have to be a global TO driven initiative. If you're a product owner, you're in control of your product, go do it.
Yeah, I would add similar in that. I think you could look at it from the corrective behavior. I'd also look at it from more of the optimistic perspective too. Is like, let's put 30% of our budget in innovation, growth, R&D, and those are often the same investment dollars. And I think you have to look and evaluate both, right? You have to fix, but I think the more we continue to encourage what we can go do, what we can accomplish. Like what's interesting to me, even going back to the reaction to what really the government's finding waste. Like for me, I get excited about the opportunity to be able to redeploy dollars to more important things. I'm amazed at some of my really close friends and family that look at that same thing and they're like, "Why are we getting rid of that?" And I'm like, we get to redeploy that into something else that actually will fuel growth versus it just continuing to work through that. And so I think the more that we continue to be optimistic and believe that will happen, the better. And I think we're in a moment of I think always in life we're going to be in a moment where do you believe in the status quo? Do you believe in growth? And how do we do that? And I think that the more we continue to encourage that, and the better. So.
Totally agree. And I think, the only thing I would add there is finding ways to create incentives to eliminate the waste. So to your point, the way that I think you address morale is by continuing to invest in innovation and growth. But what if everybody who finds, gets to keep some portion of what they find in inefficiencies? So in the Splunk example, if I took $20 million out of a licensing cost, I get to keep 5 of that to reinvest in bonusing my people differently. And the top performers, franchise players, we've talked about this before. Whether it be I can now fund some new R&D effort to find some opportunity to grow, or something else entirely. I think that would be a really cool incentive to drive that across the organization that wouldn't require a centralized team. It has all the incentive challenges you said with change management, never wanting them to show up because that'll be the Bobs from Office Space at that point. But really empowers the individuals to not hurt themselves. Because again, back to the point, if I cut my budget, my P&L, whatever you had actuals becoming budget for next year, well, I just cut $20 million. So guess what? My budget next year is $20 million less dollars than I had this year. So I think that you can find something to do that. That'd be really cool.
That'd be great.
So with that, I thank you both. I appreciate it. Thank you to our listeners. If you'd like to learn more, visit the Insights page at Credera.com. Thank you.